may seem strange to maybe conflate knowledge and democracy, but for me, it's really hard to think of those as separate things. So in this chapter, although that's the title of it, I'm not sure I really combine them. I start to think about this a little bit. And, this all goes back to Thomas Jefferson and these ideals that democracy is just a mob if the citizenry is not well educated. In other words, I'm somewhat willing to give up my ability to affect my agency to the majority of my peers, of my fellow citizens, but if and only if they're sane and they have some kind of basis for their decision making. I certainly disagree with people who are well educated and thoughtful about the particular policy issues, but the problem comes when those issues, those positions, are fundamentally badly informed. There's someone who's worked on, named James Fishkin, who's worked on deliberative democracy, which is kind of a bit different from what we do. He has some examples of how this works. So, for example, on a very technical question of energy consumption, he did this study with a group of citizens in Texas where they had to make a decision about whether a power plant should be put in place or not. This is usually something that's left to sort of experts who advise people in office, and then they make the sort of technocratic decision of where to locate it or what decision to make. Now, you could just throw that out to a proposition, right? You could throw that out to the community and say, vote on it. But the problem is that they are fundamentally uninformed about this, and they haven't had a chance to discuss it with their peers. They might read a newspaper article about it, but then their opinion is likely to be whatever the author of the newspaper article says. So what he did instead was brought them into a hotel for a weekend, gave them all thick briefing packets to read in the 2 weeks beforehand, paid them to be there for the weekend, and then had sessions where everyone discussed it with one another and reached consensus. I mean, in some ways, that seems like an ideal way of kind of governing. It's democracy, but without all the bad stuff of playing to the lowest common denominator, of pandering to base instincts. All of that stuff kind of gets blunted, at least. So the question is then, can that happen online? And the answer is no. That's not really fair. The answer is it's really difficult. I thought about assigning a different article to you for some reason in this course, I am assigning you everything I write because this is more solidly within my area. But I did some research that looked at Reddit subreddits, and especially around sort of topics of expertise. I was looking at things like those who do smart drugs and those who do keto, and we're giving fairly specific advice about how to do things, with the thought that they have this kind of lay knowledge, this knowledge that they've acquired, and thinking about the reasoning in which they discuss this and the kinds of norms that come up around that. Now, it turns out, I didn't really realize this from the discussion alone, but once I started interviewing some of these people face-to-face, or at least online, the majority of them, at least in some of these groups, were graduate students or were already professors. So it wasn't quite true that they were without that scientific knowledge, but the kind of discourse that was happening here tended not to be the same as you would find at an academic conference or something like that. So in those spaces, certainly this kind of deliberative, fact-based discourse happens, but it's, I think, by and large, far less likely. Now, is Google at fault for this? Or, is Google making us stupid is the core question here. And I will say, I am not a big fan. Maybe I can link to it. I had a discussion on a radio station with Nicholas Carr. And I think he has some basic ideas here that are correct, but he takes them to an extraordinary, I think, degree in arguing that it is fundamentally changing the way we think and interact. I mean, that's not fair. That is a fact, right? There's no question that the internet is fundamentally changing how we think and how we interact. But for him, I mean, he seems to have this very idyllic view of how people in the 80s interacted with information, that we were all at home early in the evening reading Proust and having philosophical discussions, and that the internet has made that impossible. And that, I don't think, is at all true. I think mostly the time we spend online in social spaces has replaced what we did watching Friends, on must-see TV on Thursday nights. And I don't know that that's a bad thing. So I don't go as far as Nicholas Carr's view that Google is making us stupid. But it's definitely changing the way we think. And we've already encountered this before. At a very basic level, it's something like, if you graduate from high school and don't know when Columbus arrived in the Americas, or don't know when the Constitution was signed, or when the Declaration of Independence was signed, or when, the treaty, or the basic years of U.S. involvement and other involvement in World War II, these kinds of things you really should have at top of mind, right? There's no good excuse, aside from severe memory issues, that you shouldn't know this stuff, having graduated from high school, and frankly, having graduated with a bachelor's degree. Some of those dates you should still have in your, beyond that, you should still have in your brain. Certainly, within your field of interest, you should kind of remember names and times and places and those kinds of things without having to go to Google. I say that as someone who has really poor memory. I do have difficulty at this point kind of connecting with names. One of my colleagues in the program has kind of, I grab him and point to him and say, you know what name I'm thinking of, and sometimes he does. So, I'm really bad at coming up with names, and frankly, I will space on your name when I meet you next, because I do with some of my family members, extended family. I usually remember my kid's name and my wife's name, and that's all good. But that's pretty much where I'm, the edge of my security range. So, I think that there's validity to the claim, and I've made this claim, that knowledge of how to find those dates is more important than remembering those dates, right? And so you could make the claim that you do not need to know when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, because you know how to Google that. And that number is just eating up space in your brain that you could use for something more creative or useful. Because I can always go to Wikipedia, I can always go to Google, and it will always give me that answer. So that's my kind of externalized brain. There's no reason for me to contain that stuff in my head. This goes back again to Thamus and this parable of that Neil Postman puts forward, of kind of written language being the, Plato makes this argument, well, Socrates makes this argument that written language is a curse because it makes it so we can't remember epic poems anymore. Not on my side, but on my wife's side, her grandfather and her father can recite poems that are, ballads and poems that are really, really long. They come out of an American tradition where that's not uncommon. And so, word for word, they have these kind of, even as they get older, really in their heads, and they've been usually passed from generation to generation. So it is a much more oral tradition, and you find those oral traditions usually not in the US, usually in less advanced places. There's a long kind of history of looking at orality as a way of communicating versus the written word versus kind of textual content. But do we lose something there? Yeah, I think we do, honestly. Like, when we lose that ability to remember poetry or drama in our brains that we can call on, or, even like song lyrics, I guess, depending on the lyrics, or music that we can play. When we lose that from our memory, I think that's a loss. When we lose the ability to do history, I have this thought of, we've had some blackouts in places when I've been teaching, and I thought, what happens like if we lose everything? Do I go to the campus the next day and still teach? I can't teach this way, but do I go to the campus and still teach? And yeah, I do. Because a lot of that's still in my head, right? And it can still go, through that discussion and through lecturing and discussion, we can still kind of convey that stuff without needing textbooks, without needing a copy machine, without needing, a word processor, pencil and paper, and or even not even pencil and paper. Being able to talk through things is enough to do kind of what I do. But we have shifted in the way that we interact with those things. So I've been among those people who've argued that, on the one hand, I've argued that we don't need to memorize all this stuff, and I'm still frustrated when my kids don't know their times tables, right? So there's some stuff that we still have to internalize just because it speeds things up. But a lot of this, I think, if you know all this information but have the inability to search, sift, and make sense of what's online, and synthesize that into something useful, then that's a serious problem. And it's a serious problem not just for you individually, but socially, because I think we all need to be able to have that ability. It frustrates me more than most when our legislators don't know how to use the internet, because it suggests that they also are lacking in modern knowledge. That's a problem, not something to be vaunted in some way. So, in this chapter, I make the suggestion that what we need is search intellectuals, people that can connect this knowledge to people in various ways and make it useful. I have to say, I don't think that I like that claim when I made it. I'm not sure how well it's aged. Of everything in the book, I think that claim that we should, that at least those who are capable should have a very strong understanding of how search works and be able to act as translators for those who don't, I don't think it's held up very well. And I think it's been criticized a bit, and I think that's fair criticism. So I'm not sure about that piece. That said, it does kind of raise this question of what does it mean to be educated and bright and knowledgeable during the search engine, within a search engine oriented intellectual space. And the internet has taken over as this intellectual space. And I think it changes kind of the way we think and the way we know and the way we learn. All of those things. That frankly, that you are learning. One of the questions was, is this going to kill the? Are things like Wikipedia and search engines going to kill the university? Well, you're here in a university program, but it's absolutely changing the university. I've not walked into the library on my university campus for 4 years at least, and before that, very infrequently. And you see that in the way the libraries are organized. The stacks are disappearing and being replaced by more computer stations and meeting rooms, right? The books are being stored off-site where you can order them up if you need them, but a lot of them are being thrown into off-site storage so that they aren't using spaces on stacks. I grew up in stacks. Part of my intellectual framework was going to a library and working through the stacks, being very distracted by all the books I didn't need to read while I was looking for something. And so a lot of my learning in my university experience, both undergraduate and graduate, was doing that, was going into a library to get a particular book and being distracted by everything on that shelf and kind of pulling a chunk of them off and going and sitting down and reading somewhere. And that's kind of disappeared for us. Now that should be happening somehow online, but you are not getting the same consistency in the material that shows up online as you would in things that show up on a library shelf. It's as simple as that. So there's one issue, is that has shifted entirely. I talked briefly about the idea of the filter bubble, which is we tend to have selective processing, and we hear from people that we agree with more often, and we tend to find things that we're looking for. We have these kind of intellectual biases that allow us to find things that are confirming our beliefs or confirming our knowledge, and so we tend to go down rabbit holes and stay there. I think that a lot of people have now looked at Parasort and said that this was an overstatement as well. That it turns out that people who, for example, are partisans online are better able to state their opponent's position than those who are not partisans. It's kind of a counterintuitive finding, but that those who are very strongly in believing in one area are better able, not worse able, to posit the opposite position. So they do have that broader understanding. So I think it's a little bit of that and a little bit not. Overall, I think that it's really hard to get knowledge about the way we get knowledge, to learn about the way we learn, but that for a couple of reasons. One is that it's just that reflexive process. But the other is that it's just changing so quickly that it's almost impossible to get on top of that. So this leads into the question of policymaking, but it's an important kind of issue here because we don't really understand what's happening with our knowledge systems. And because of that, it makes it much harder to make, and it's changing so quickly. Because of those two things, it makes it so much harder to make policy that actually is effective in the long term.